Well, here I am in Chetham's library in Manchester, and here is the portrait of Humphrey Chetham, the founder, in the 1650s. And this is the reading room. This is where I have been working. And here in this alcove is the desk where Engels and Marx worked in the 1840s. And that is where Dr. Douglas Farnie will be sitting while I interview him. Well, now Dr. Farnie has arrived. I'm going to pretend to be him for a moment. And this is where I'm going to have him sitting, and we'll see what that's like. I think I'm now recording, so let's begin. I'm Negley Harte, and it's the 9th of January 2003, and I'm here in Manchester in Chetham's library talking to Dr. Douglas Farnie. Douglas Farnie is perhaps the senior surviving member of the great famous School of Economic History at the University of Manchester. And he's sitting, I don't know if it's appropriate, Douglas, at the desk where Engels and Marx worked when Marx first visited Manchester in 1845. Now, I don't expect your memories of Manchester go back quite to 1845, but they do go back a long way because you are a Mancunian born and bred.
That is correct, yes. I spent the first part of my life in Manchester from 1926 to 1953, apart from the service in the army from 44 to 48. And then there was a gap from 54 to 1960 when I emigrated to South Africa.
Yes.
I returned to Manchester and remained here from 1961 onwards. So that is a brief history.
Right. And Manchester must be an important influence on you in all sorts of ways.
Oh yes.
Particularly as a historian.
Yes. Yes.
You went after the army, you came up to the university here in, that would be in 48.
1948, yes.
In 48, to be a student. Now, did you already think of yourself as an economic historian?
No, definitely not. No. I had begun to study the subject in 1942 at Salford Grammar School under the teaching of Mr. Robert M. Headley, who was a pupil of Unwin in 1922. He introduced me to the subject first, but I was interested in, I think, modern history, and I had been led in that direction by reading historical novels, particularly those by Raphael Sabatini.
Goodness.
And I was very interested in the period of the Italian Renaissance and the period of the French Revolution. There was a magnificent novel, I remember, dealing with the great expedition to Quiberon Bay, 1795, to aid the rebel Bretons against the revolution. Yes.
Well, that sounds quite a way away from Manchester.
Oh yes, yes, yes. I was definitely interested in history really from the later days of my schooling, but not specifically.
So you already thought of yourself as a historian, a committed historian, when you came up to Manchester to read history.
Yes.
But what about the teachers of history that you had at the time? Were any of those an influence on you?
Well, Redford was the professor whose special subject I took in my final year. His special subject covered British economic and social history, 1830 to 1848, the age of reform, as it was named in the syllabus. And he built up a school of 10 scholars in economic history during the 1950s, including the first lecturer in social history in the United Kingdom, Harold Perkin.
Yes.
And he then went to become the first professor of social history at the University of Lancaster. And the other members of the school included Helmut Königsberger on
Yes.
early modern
Yes.
economic and social history, who
Yes.
later went to London, as well as the more famous and familiar names of Thomas Stuart Welland and William Henry Challoner.
Yes.
And-
Well, I wanted to ask you about them, but let me ask you first to say a little bit more about Professor Redford,
Yeah.
because he's before my time, and I don't know how many people still living knew him. What did you make of Redford?
Well, Redford was essentially a very human person, and he was the brother-in-law of T.S. Ashton, and his career at Manchester was in fact dogged by the relationship with Ashton, because the two scholars were in different faculties. Neither of them were professors, but Ashton spent, I think, 24 years at Manchester without being promoted to the rank of professor, and the same is true of Redford. And the reason for that was inter-faculty rivalry. One faculty blocking the nomination that was put forward by the other, the Faculty of Arts against the Faculty of Commerce. That was quite incredible to scholars of a later age. Here are two of the most eminent scholars in the subject, and they're denied a chair. And finally, Ashton was invited by Tawney to accept a chair at the LSE in 1944, and Redford was invited, promoted to a chair at Manchester. And that satisfied both the scholars and their wives. Most important.
Yes, but apart from their personal relationship, am I not right in thinking that a peculiarity of Manchester is that there is a strong economic history tradition in both those faculties? Because I take it that George Unwin, the first professor of economic history in this country in 1910, was in the history faculty, but I take it that in the economics faculty there was a tradition of economic history going back to S.J. Chapman
And earlier.
G.W. Daniels.
And to the time of Alfred Flux, who first began lecturing on the subject in 1893, 17 years before Unwin's arrival.
Flux, it was in economics, was it?
He was the professor of political economy.
Right.
Yes, and he developed the teaching of economic history and of business education, which Chapman continued. And you're perfectly right about in fact, the Faculty of Commerce were the real pioneers of the subject, because it was Flux, Chapman, Daniels, and their later scholars like John Jukes.
Oh yes, and Ashton himself, of course.
Oh yes,
should have put in that line. So why was it that when Unwin was brought to Manchester in 1910, that he wasn't in that faculty?
That, I think, must be due to the dominant influence of Tout.
Yes.
The appointment of Unwin to a chair in the Faculty of Arts was I think, the sole work of Thomas Frederick Tout, the real founder of the Manchester School of History. And he was determined to, I think, give economic history a much stronger share in the history syllabus.
Now you can't have known Tout.
Oh no.
He's before your time.
Yes.
I did slightly know his son, Herbert Tout, who was
yes.
our reader in political economy for many decades. And I slightly knew him. That's an intriguing link with a long past.
I think I met the daughter, Mary Tout, when she came to attend a Neale lecture in Manchester. Yes.
Right.
But Unwin's role in the university was, I think, unique, because when the Great War broke out, Unwin opposed it vehemently, as John Morley did, representing the great tradition of Manchester liberalism. Morley resigned from the cabinet because he realised that going to war would mean the end of Britain and the end of Europe as it had been built up during the 19th century. And Unwin was a pacifist and a fierce opponent of the war. In fact, this theme of Unwin's is closely connected with his views of the state in history, and his view that the action of and influence of the state throughout history has been predominantly malicious and evil, and it must be curbed and controlled, and the field of social action must be left to the small platoons of society, the voluntary associations, rather than the great compulsory association of the state.
Yes. Would this have been the view of the Anti-Corn Law League and Compton and Bright? I mean, does it go back to a Manchester tradition of free trade liberalism?
I think so, because their attitude was also hostile to the state and hostile to warfare. Both Compton and Bright in particular. And yes, this is emphatically the tradition of the Manchester School of the 1840s. But during the Great War, I think the Faculty of Commerce could have become infected by this same attitude, because in 1916, Unwin, although a professor in the Faculty of Arts, was nominated and accepted the post of Dean of the Faculty of Commerce, an actual unique tribute to a professor in the Faculty of Arts. Apparently his colleagues in the Faculty of Arts were keen on the war, and they boycotted Unwin. But in the Faculty of Commerce, I think they had a wider view, and they welcomed him and they nominated him as Dean, which was a great honour. And I think it was Unwin who carried the school to its peak in the early 1920s. His pupils and associates and friends were Tawney, Hammond, Daniels, Ashton, above all Ashton, because Ashton said that the reason why I went to Manchester was to be with Unwin. And the 5 years he spent in close association with Unwin, 1921 to 25, were the golden years of Ashton's existence. He always looked back on them with deep nostalgia, and he wrote, I think, 4 different tributes to Unwin in various publications.
Yes.
So
now, Unwin, of course, when one thinks of the development of economic history as a subject, what you say about the state is very interesting, because insofar as the economic history being created as a subject, certainly if one thinks of Cunningham providing the first major textbook for it, it is very much sort of state-orientated. Legislation and the proclamations of policy and so on is really the theme. But once you get to Unwin, he's doing research, he's creating, am I not right in thinking, what we later call business history. Because he's looking at micro records of actual economic activity, and he works on the pioneering book on Oh No and other work like that.
Yes, it was Unwin who unearthed 4 separate batches of business records. Old No, the Gregs of Style, and McConnell and Kennedy of Ancoats, and Peter Stubbs. And all of those 4 provided an immense resource for future scholars. Ashton in particular latched on to the Stubbs material and published his first article on those papers as early as 1926 in Economica. But Unwin carried the school to its heights. Redford was perhaps his most notable pupil and successor. His great work was labour migration in England, 1800 to 1850, which Clapham praised very highly. In the 1930s, Redford went on to explore the history of Manchester merchants, and two great volumes appeared in 1931 and 1954, carrying the story down to the 1950s. But Redford also wrote a great history of municipal government, in Manchester,
yes,
in
indeed.
3 volumes.
Oh.
And this diverted his energies into a direction that was perhaps not as propitious for his career and his external influence as one might have hoped, because Sheena Simon actually captured the market for the subject by producing a short 1-volume work in 1938 on the same subject. But Redford's work is not only a history of municipal government, it is a social and economic history.
It's a classic
well.
work, surely,
it is.
by any standards. Yeah.
Yes. But Unwin, after 1925, his tradition was carried on by Conrad Gill in Ireland in his work on the Irish linen industry. The preface to that work acknowledges the depth. It was carried on by George Henry Toppling as well, author of the Economic History of Rossendale. And much later on, Gwyn Williams, the great Welsh radical, who began as a medievalist, studied the Commune of London, and in 1968 Gwyn Williams reviewed Hobsbawm's Industry and Empire, and in reviewing that in New Society, Gwyn Williams wrote, "For the first time for many years, something of the genius, the human skill, the social perception of the great and forgotten George Unwin sends green shoots up through the ashen and napalmed moonscape of this discipline."
When was that?
That was 1968, New
1968.
Society, 18th of April.
Splendid.
Magnificent
Yes.
tribute.
Yes.
And of course emphasising the role of the small platoons, the voluntary associations,
Yes.
which provided the subject of Unwin's first article, A Trade Union of the 17th Century.
Yes.
And in my book on cotton in 1979, in the preface, I cited your collection of inaugural lectures, but I also cited an article of Unwin. It was a review article of J.G. Williamson, and Unwin's dismissive reference to the mythopoeic illusions of the patriotic imagination.
Yes, how splendid.
Yes.
Yes.
So,
a consciousness always of this tradition, and I've got one thing that characterises your work, of course, is that it's in this tradition, but that it's very conscious of being part of a historiographic tradition, which you're very consciously maintaining a close relationship with a sort of continuity. That's a characteristic of your writing.
Yes. Yes. Perhaps I might just mention that one great inspiring teacher at Manchester in my student days was Lewis Namier,
Of
a
course.
professor of modern history. And I think every student of history is entitled during his undergraduate days to actually sit at the feet of a great teacher. And I had that privilege listening to Namier. And may I just say that in Eric Hobsbawm's recent autobiography, I think he does less than justice to Namier by describing him as parochial. in his interests because of his work on 18th century parliamentary history. Namier was not parochial. He was immensely wide-ranging in his interests, his interest in particular in the history of Europe in the 19th and the 20th centuries.
When you say he was a great teacher, do you mean he was a great lecturer?
He was a great lecturer, yes. His style was unique. There was no one quite like Namier in his lecturing style. His sense of humour was distinctly individual, and his view of history, of course, is familiar. He was intensely conservative, and I think he represents the great tradition of the émigrés from Central Europe who came to England and did so much for the intellectual development of England and America. Yes.
Perhaps particularly in Manchester.
Yes.
Intellectually, but economically too, of course.
Oh yes. Yeah. And Manchester, of course, had from the 1820s this great tradition of hospitality to foreign merchants. And those foreign merchants were the real instruments of the rise of the Lancashire cotton industry to global ascendancy. And Redford has published his 2 volumes on the subject, but the real influence of those merchants has only come to be assessed by Lloyd Jones and Stanley Chapman in their works of the 1980s, and it is still, I think, a gap in historiography that the role of the Manchester merchants, the foreign merchants in particular, is not given its due. There's, I think, far too much emphasis on technology and the great inventions.
Yes, yes. Well, we might come back to that, but I'm still thinking of your period as a student when you were first at the University of Manchester in the late 40s. And you talk about Redford, and now you talk about Namier. But earlier you mentioned W.O. Henderson and, and Bill Challoner.
Yeah.
Now, were they both teachers of yours?
Yes, I attended Challoner's lectures in my first year. He took over from Stone of Oxford, who covered the medieval period. Challoner covered the period from 1500 to 1750 in the first year course in English economic history. Yes, and I attended Henderson's lectures on European economic history, 1830 to 1848, in my third year. Henderson was, again, a person who brought the continental tradition to Manchester. He lectured in his study, but he always wore his gown, even when seated. But it was Henderson who paid me a remarkable tribute after the death of Challoner. Henderson and myself assembled a collection of essays, Challoner's best essays, and we worked together. When the time came for publication, Henderson kindly allowed my name to precede his on the title page, which was very generous of him and greatly appreciated.
Yeah. Yes. Now, I knew, of course, Bill Challoner, and much knew and liked Bill Challoner such a lot. Remind us of his personality and interests.
Challoner was a remarkable individual, full of life. In his early years he was intensely serious, but by the 1950s he had become more light-hearted, and he was well known as a hail fellow, well met, intensely gregarious, revealing different aspects of his personality to different individuals. Um, he was a great joiner. He went to international congresses. He was a leading figure in many of the intellectual societies of Manchester, including the Chatham Society, together with Willan and Roskell and Ward. And he was also a great influence on the reprint boom of the 1960s, where he encouraged the publisher Cass to produce a series of reprints of industrial classics, to which he often contributed bibliographical introductions, which were...
He had a remarkable bibliographical knowledge.
He did, yes.
And a recall.
Yes, yes.
And he had this gregarious side where he used to like to go around teasing people and provoking the bien-pensant. Whereas Henderson always seemed to me to be much more of a recluse. Is perhaps going too far, but he didn't appear at conferences in the same way that Challoner did.
No, not in England. Henderson attended conferences on the continent, especially in Germany.
Oh.
His reputation in Germany was extremely high.
Right.
Yes.
You've also mentioned T.S. Willan.
Oh yes.
Who, am I right, eventually succeeds Redford as the professor.
Yes.
Now, he was a quiet and old-fashioned person as far as I was concerned. Did you understand Willan?
Over time, I think I did discern one element which was of key influence in his character. Willan came from the North Country, from the Dales of Yorkshire, and he was a keen observer of social distinctions. He emphasised the gulf that separated the dwellers of the lower reaches of the valley from those in the upper reaches of the valley. It was, a minute distinction, but very real, apparently. And but Willan was a son of the Mounts, and he turned against established religion. And as a result, in his published works, there is virtually no reference to the church or religion. And his last monograph was on Elizabethan Manchester. And in that monograph, there is no reference whatsoever to the church, although the 16th and early 17th centuries were of immense importance in this region, because Lancashire became the last papist stronghold in England and continued to be a stronghold of Catholicism into the 19th and 20th centuries.
Yeah. You taught at the University of Manchester for a time, but then you went to the University of Natal. Why did you go to South Africa?
I think it was harsh necessity. I applied for posts in England at Leicester and at Kiel, but was unsuccessful. And then a post was advertised at Natal, and I went down to London for interview, and the panel included Professor Treharne from the University of Wales and Gerald S. Graham of London, Professor of Imperial History.
King's College.
Yes. And I was fortunate in securing an appointment as a lecturer in economic history in the University of Natal, Durban. And I stayed there for 7 years.
And you enjoyed it?
Oh yes, it was a great experience. I was extremely happy in South Africa, and there I also taught, as well as economic history, I taught the history of Western civilization as a first-year course modelled on the American courses called Western Civ, which were a standby of American universities down to the 1970s, when they suffered intellectual exile then. and I had to begin with prehistory of all subjects, and I lectured to non-Europeans, to Europeans, and to part-time Europeans, 3 separate classes, very often covering the same field. And
Right.
this was quite a challenge, but it did prove rewarding.
But you came back to Manchester in 1961, as you've already said, and then stayed on. Now, if you look at the membership figures of the Economic History Society, there is this period that actually begins in 1947 and carries on right up to 1977, when each year the number of members of the society increases year on year, right up to 77. And obviously we can look at numbers of people taking degrees and numbers of departments and so on. These were a long boom, not just in the 60s, but beginning all through the 50s, 60s, 70s. Economic history was a booming subject.
Yes.
Well, at what point in that period did you become conscious that you were part of a booming subject?
It may well have been with my initial appointment to Manchester in 1961. This could have been about the time of the Robbins report.
Yeah, 63.
Yes. Well,
But yes.
the general expansion of the
Yep.
subject, and I was invited to lecture on early modern economic history and medieval economic history, because this was a field that I shared with Malcolm Bean, who was a medievalist through and through, and was later appointed to Columbia University, New York. And Bean was succeeded by Ian Kershaw from Liverpool, who began...
Oh, in the days when he was a medievalist?
He began as a medievalist, like Barraclough, and Barraclough changed, I think, to the study of modern history, and Ian Kershaw also moved over from medieval to modern history, and achieved his eminence with his 2-volume biography of Hitler. Yes.
Yes. So this was you were rejoining what you were conscious of being a classic historical tradition when you came back to Manchester.
Yes. I was privileged to actually take over the first year course in economic history from which I shared with a medievalist, but this was the largest class in economic history in the department.
A special feature of Manchester economic history, it always seemed to me, was the stream of publications that came from the Manchester University Press. You mentioned Cass and his reprints of the 60s, that was a very important influence. But going back to the 1920s, 30s, certainly 60s, 70s, I think the tradition has now been lost for Manchester University Press. But for a long period, many of the most classical works in the subject came from Manchester University Press. Why was that?
The Manchester University Press was another of Tout's great foundations, 1902. And for 70 years it published works of scholarship wholly at a loss. And then in the year 1971, the University Press made a profit. It could not believe its good fortune, and unfortunately, making a profit proved a turning point in the history of the press. It abandoned its past traditions, and it sought to move into a larger league of publishers. I think this was fatal, but it began with studies in medieval history, and Unwin was the author of the first publication in the field of economic history, Manchester Studies in Economic History, that is Samuel Oldknow and the Arkwrights, 1925. And then there followed the works of Ashton, I think Conrad Gill and Redford.
Yeah. Well, and one that has always particularly fascinated me was, of course, Wadsworth and Mann.
Oh, yes.
On Manchester, on the origins of the cotton industry. Now, I can see that Douglas is holding up a photograph of, is that A.P. Wadsworth?
Alfred Powell Wadsworth.
And is he holding a copy of the Manchester Guardian?
He has the proofs of a Guardian article before him, yes.
Very good. Now, did you know him?
No. When I emigrated to South Africa in the end of '53, I did write to the Guardian at Challoner's suggestion. He said the Guardian may need another correspondent in South Africa. So I offered my services, but Wadsworth as editor thought that he had enough correspondence in South Africa at that time and didn't require an additional one.
Right. I knew, of course, quite well Miss Mann, his collaborator in that famous book on industrial Lancashire.
Yes.
But Miss Mann was always rather ladylike, and she didn't like to gossip. She resisted gossiping about Wadsworth or Tawney or Lipson, various of the people I tried to get her to talk about. But she had nothing but nice things to say about people, even about Lipson, who nobody else ever said anything. You can't have known Lipson, can you?
No. Only in his work, yes.
Wadsworth I have a special interest in because I believe that, like me, he was born in Rochdale.
Yes.
And his first job was on the Rochdale Observer.
Yes.
And his first claim on economic history fame is that, am I not right in remembering that he attended R.H. Tawney's first WEA class?
Yes.
Held in Rochdale in, would this be, I've forgotten the date,
1910, perhaps 1910.
1910.
Yes.
As a young reporter. And
yes.
Tawney turns him into an economic historian.
Yes.
And when he's sent to London, was he the London editor of the Manchester Guardian before he became the editor? I think he was in London for a long time, and he started to work in the PRO, which was just around the corner, of course, from Fleet Street, on all the Lancashire Palatinate stuff.
I thought that Julia tackled the PRO end of the collaboration.
Yes. Not completely. I don't think that's completely true.
Oh.
He did a lot of work in the PRO because it was just around the corner.
I see. Oh, well, this is new to me, but
it's a funny collaboration. If you remember, all the chapters are written by one or the other of them.
Oh, yes.
And they're sort of spatchcocked together, but it's not
yes.
really a cooperation.
Well, I spoke to Julia once about that arrangement, and she said that they did work as individuals, and then the separate chapters
yes.
were just put together. The interesting thing is that each chapter, the author of each chapter is identified in the chapters, yes. which is, I think, unusual.
Yes.
And an interesting feature of their collaboration is that Julia was working on her PhD at London, but was then invited to become vice principal of an Oxford college, and her PhD thesis did tend to go by the board. As a result, Julia always remained Miss Mann rather than Dr. Mann, whereas Wadsworth, a working journalist, was given an honorary doctorate by Manchester in 1953 and became Dr. Wadsworth.
And did he use the title?
No. An interesting sidelight.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Now, what other great Manchester economic historians should we be thinking about? Other people that we've not
there
yet
was
mentioned?
A very unusual scholar, T.W. Fletcher, who was an agrarian historian,
yes.
and he was based in the Faculty of Commerce, and he was the author of a classic article on the depression in
The agricultural depression.
I think first in the northwest and then in England as a whole, 1873 to 1896. But he was a very likable person. Unfortunately, he died young. It was a tragic loss. Yes. And he did contribute, I think, a critical note to one of the translations from the German that Challoner and Henderson undertook, I think.
No.
Yes, it may have been Hoffman's work.
Oh yes. T.S. Ashton once said that all great economic historians were born within 10 miles of Manchester. And I've always had a rather equivocal attitude to that, since I was born 12 miles from Manchester. And of course there were quite a number of Mancunians, or people one doesn't normally think of as Mancunians, such as Eileen Power, who I suppose you can't have known since she died in 1940. But you mentioned several times T.S. Ashton himself.
Yes.
Did you have a close relationship with him?
No, only indirectly through one of his graduate students, and that was Bob Fitton, Robert Sucksmith Fitton,
Yes.
who was full of praise for Ashton, and we actually came to meet as postgraduate students working on the records of the Struts of Belper and Milford, and Fitton was working on the early period, and I was allotted the later period, 1850 to 1900, and Redford asked Henderson to take me along to where the Strutt records were located in the basement of the Dover Street Library. And so I went along to these records, and it was then that calamity overtook my postgraduate research, because I returned to these records for several days and I turned over the pages of these ledgers, and I realized that it was impossible for me to make head or tail of them, given my what little expertise I had in the field of business records. So I abandoned the actual business history of the Strutt firm, and I went to London to the Registrar of Companies, where I worked on the company files of every joint stock company registered in the cotton industry between 1854 and 1896, and this gave me a basis for my MA thesis.
I was going to say, was that the subject of your MA thesis?
Yes.
But you were nearly a business historian working on the Strutts.
Yes,
Very, so you mean instead of Fitton and Wadsworth, we might have had Fitton and Farnie.
That is true. But in my thesis, I did include a chapter on the great firms of Lancashire, and those firms were 3 in number: Rylands, Tootles and Horrockses. And the section on Rylands was a few pages listing the building up of an industrial empire. And I must say that it was a competent piece of work, but it missed the whole secret of John Rylands and the firm that he assembled. And it was only 40 years later, in 1998, that I published an article on John Rylands as a Manchester merchant, which told the true story behind the building up of the first great multinational firm based in Manchester, the firm that made John Rylands a multimillionaire when he died in 1888. And I was able to publish earlier in 1993 a biography of John Rylands, which did include a business history of the firm down to the time of its demise.
And what was the secret?
The secret, I think, lay in John Rylands' intense religious convictions, which became manifest particularly after the death of his mother in 1829. He was born in 1801. For the first 28 years of his life, he was largely conventional in his approach to life, to religion and to commerce. He was intent on prospering and on making money. In 1829, the death of his mother, who had devoted intense care to bringing him up from the time when he was born as a very weak and sickly infant, John Rylands changed his outlook completely. He decided that he would look out for other people. He would seek to help others rather than focus on his own narrow interests. And from 1898 he did that. He maintained his firm, but he also developed a range of charitable interests. And the curious thing is that this did not hinder him from prospering. In fact, he prospered more than ever before in his life, an incredible achievement. And he does represent the great tradition of dissent and liberalism in Manchester. And here, I wonder if I could just introduce another character.
Please do.
Haslam Mills. William...
Yes. A little higher up, Douglas, that we can see him. Yes, there he is.
William Haslam Mills, born in Ashton-under-Lyne and senior reporter on the Manchester Guardian from the Great War to 1922 under the aegis of Charles Prestwich Scott, of course. Haslam Mills was the great exponent of Lancashire, of Manchester, and the links between dissent and liberalism. One of his great judgments was the following. It was understood that God had read the Manchester Guardian that morning, but his great achievement was to write about the world of Cotonia and its capital city. And he portrayed these two in a perspective and in a language unknown before. He sought always to correct entrenched and misleading stereotypes. What he did was to associate the selling of calico, a prosaic function, with the broad sweep of human progress. Victorian Manchester, to Haslam Mills, remained the powerful provincial city which laid down the law for England and which deemed itself, as Rochdale once had done in the 1840s, the hub of the universe. Manchester was unusual in Haslam Mills's opinion because it remained almost totally destitute of the Greek conception of the state. It never became a Whig city. It did, however, become an active manufactory of agitation and thought, a mecca for manufacturing and dissenting England, a city with a soul. It stood for an idea, the idea of free trade. Haslam Mills emphasised the metropolitan functions of Manchester and the integrating role of commerce, typified by the warehouses of Portland Street, the street through which the history of the human race ran for a time. Lancashire itself remained the messianic corner of earth in which the new world was announced, the country which has called itself a county and is called by others a county, but one which has always given itself the airs of a continent. That was Haslam Mills.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Very good. Well, it's very interesting to see Manchester now compared to what I remember of Manchester in the 50s and early 60s, which was a much more boring town, where they were pulling down a lot of the Victorian heritage. Whereas now, I think very nicely preserved warehouses, And Manchester's got so much more lively, it seems to me, in the last generation, and so much more respectful of this of this industrial and commercial tradition. Am I being
yeah.
naive?
Oh no, you're perfectly right. There has taken place a real renaissance of Manchester life, particularly in the 1980s, although it probably dates back to the 60s, when the great educational revolution reached the region and half of the city became virtually a campus city. And that is being carried forward in the latest stage, which is an amalgamation between the two great universities, the University of Manchester and UMIST, which together hope to create a global centre of excellence with 40,000 students and thousands of members of staff.
Yes. Well, now, absolutely splendid, of course, but what will be the role of economic history in this? Because if you look at the membership figures of the Economic History Society, 47 to 77, you have this onward and upward growth all the time. But then, by extraordinary coincidence, the year after the Society celebrated its Jubilee in 1976, the very next year, the membership figures started to go down, and they've gone down ever since. And many of the departments established and expanded in the 50s and 60s were closed down or amalgamated, and less students came forward to take the subject at A-level, to take degrees in the subject, and it appeared to some that the boom was over. And several people have written about the decline of economic history. Now, what do you think about that, Douglas?
There was a great change in the decade of the 1960s with the advent of the cliometric revolution from America, and also the great upsurge of social history in a variety of forms, which Hobsbawm has dealt with in his autobiography. And I think that the interest in social history will continue and may well embrace economic history, as the Council of the Society is intensely aware. The cliometric revolution came to Manchester in the person of Robert Fogel in 1965, when the Economic History Society held its conference in Manchester, and Fogel delivered a famous lecture on the subject. The Manchester School of Economic History, which was much wider than the university because it embraced journalists like Wadsworth and Hammond. The Manchester School of Economic History was not in tune with the great advances in economic theory and quantitative method. It only appointed a representative of the new tradition in the year 1974 in the person of Theo Balderstone. And this was after Musson succeeded Willen as Professor of Economic History. This was Manchester paying homage to the tidal wave of change that had swept over the world of economic history from distant Indiana.
But was this a tidal wave that you welcomed, Douglas? They rather aggressively called it the new economic history, didn't they, for a time?
Oh yes, yes. Well, it was a challenge, a tremendous challenge. And on the positive side, the great advantage that this revolution brought about was the immense expansion in the range of sources, because quantitative sources could be manufactured and be created on the spot, virtually new sources. Now this was something that historians had been denied for centuries, but the new economic historians, they created this wealth of sources, quantitative series, and this was a great advantage to set against the other side, which is the question of readability. What distinguishes pleometric history and the new economic history is that it's the only branch of history which has had to be interpreted to the general reader in the form of general articles and short studies which summarise the achievements of the new discipline for the benefit of those readers who cannot cope with the normal article in econometric style. I think this is a tremendous disadvantage, losing contact with the reading public.
I see that, but otherwise you have quite a generous judgment on it. But the judgment of students was quite clear. It turned them off, and it turned them away in very large numbers.
Yes.
Yes. Obviously there's quantification, and computers, of course, in research terms, have transformed the subject in key ways which can be seen as useful in good ways. And of course what you call social history, which I take it we think of as a branch of economic history,
Yeah.
but of course has all sorts of people who've done all sorts of things that they think of as being a rather different tradition to the economic history tradition.
Oh yes, yes.
But they've done quite interesting stuff.
Yes, oh yes, yes. But my own view is that social and economic history should remain very closely interlinked. I would be unhappy about separating social history off as a separate discipline and reading inaugural lectures about the future of social history or wither social history, titles like that. No, I think that the seamless web of history is still a noble ideal and particularly applicable to the links between social and economic. Was it Freeman who coined that phrase? Possibly. The seamless web.
That could, of course, be a good note on which to fade out. There are 4 more minutes on this tape. Is there anything else that you would have liked us to talk about?
There is one character whom I might mention.
Please do.
That is Frida Utley, who was a pioneer economic historian. She became a Ratan Tata student of the LSE in 1926 and produced a monograph of fundamental importance, Lancashire and the Far East, in 1931. The peculiarity of Frida Utley is that she became a communist. She was a student at King's College, London. She became a communist after visiting Russia in 1926, and she remained a member of the party until 1930. More than that, she married a Russian. More than that, she emigrated to Moscow and lived in Moscow for 6 years from 1931 to 36. Then her husband was arrested and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. Frida never saw her husband again. She left Moscow, returned to England, and in 1940 emigrated to the United States. She became an expert on China and Japan. Her most famous work was Japan's Feet of Clay, 1936, a bestseller, which Faber reprinted with in a cheap edition, and on the dust jacket it had this slogan: "This book is banned in Japan." And in 1940, Frida Utley published her most important book, The Dream We Lost, which expressed the disillusion of a communist who had become a fervent anti-communist. For the rest of her life, Frida devoted her energies to fighting what she saw as the evil state of Stalin's Russia. She died in Washington in 1978, and I'm pleased to say that her biography will appear in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography.
You've written it?
Yes.
Very good. Did you actually know her?
No, but I met her son. I met her son in October in Westminster, London, at a conference to which I was invited as a guest, a meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society, a meeting of 500 economists who were dedicated to the philosophy of the free market. And John Basil Utley, born in Moscow in 1934, has become a fierce critic of modern American foreign policy and the gospel of American empire. And he became a businessman, and he is my first link with Frida. Yes.
What an extraordinary story.
Oh, yes. She became, I would say, the Antigone of the modern age and the modern world, dedicated without compunction to the pursuit of truth, freedom and justice.
Douglas, thank you very much.
Thank you, Negley.